Thank you so much for having me. My name is Katrina Anderson. I work at the Commonwealth Foundation, and if you're not familiar, we're very similar to your group in that we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, independent research and educational institution. So our goal is very similar to your group. We want to take on a lot of the policy issues that are facing the state, and we want to make sure people are aware. So my title is I'm actually our Director of Government Affairs, so I work a lot with our legislators to make sure they're aware. But we have an active arm going to grassroots, media, any way we can try to bring awareness to these issues. So I just want to thank you guys for what you're doing, because I hope you know that the voices that when you attend the rallies and you're sending the letters to your legislators, how important that is and how much we appreciate it at our group, because part of what we want to help do is give you the ammunition and information to go and speak to your legislators. So today we're going to be talking about the pension bomb, and what I want to cover is why pensions first. So at the Commonwealth Foundation, we're about 12 of us, and so what we do each year is we decide what are going to be the policies that we're going to focus on. And what we're looking at is what is transformable and what is achievable in Pennsylvania. And we've decided that pension reform is one of those areas which we feel is vital. So right now in Pennsylvania, we have a $41 billion unfunded liability. And essentially that's debt that the state has. But that's $41 billion. Now, I don't have any children, but my niece Scarlett is 1 year old. And the way the pension system has been set up is that they're not going to pay off that unfunded liability for 30 years. So my niece Scarlett is going to be 30 before this pension obligation, which has been pushed, kind of kicked down the road, is paid off. And so the reason we picked pensions is very similar to the property taxes in that we don't think anyone should be kicked out of their house. And pensions is connected, so even if you're not a state employee, everyone is going to be affected by pensions. What they're estimating is that in the next 3-4 years, you're going to see your taxes go up about $1,000. And part of that will be property, part of that is state, but that's to try to start paying off that $41 billion unfunded liability. And so what we want to do is make sure that they're not kicking that can down the road, so that my niece or your children or their grandchildren aren't having to pay this off as they're growing up, because we need to be responsible. And if we made promises, what we say is some bad promises were made to some really good people. So no one's blaming the teachers or the state workers for what happened with pensions. But right now, we have this huge unfunded liability. So we want to make sure we're not kicking that can down the road. And we want to make sure that your house isn't being threatened because you're on a fixed income and can't afford this increase in property taxes. And it's at a point where they really can't kick the can down the road. So that is really one of the reasons why we decided that this is something that the Commonwealth Foundation, we want to bring awareness to. Another thing to remember is that as the pension issue is increasing, I think it'd be clear to make sure we're all on the same page too. If anyone's not familiar with the pension, the best way to explain it is a pension is a guaranteed income for life. So this is normally given to state employees or federal employees. They'll have a pension. And so they're guaranteed based on years of service. There's a certain multiplier rate, and their salary, a certain amount of income they'll receive for the rest of their life. Now this is compared to in the private sector, you'll normally have a defined contribution, and that would be similar to a 401k. You put a certain amount of your money in, your employer might match it, and you'll have the returns of investment to retire on, but it's very different than the pension. And so what we're trying to do is that we'd like a solution that is both affordable, predictable, and reliable. But first we're going to talk about how we got to this pension mess. And on that side table, I put some resources there which go into greater detail. So if someone's interested, you can find great in-depth detail on the pensions. But 12 years ago, we actually had a surplus in our pension system. And if anyone has questions or I go over something, you are welcome to raise your hand, and I don't want to leave any questions unanswered, so please let me know. But 12 years ago, we actually had a huge surplus in our pension fund. And now we're looking at a $41 billion unfunded liability. So how did we get here? There are really 4 major areas that we want to look at. The reason we advocate switching from the pension system to new employees into a 401k, similar to the private sector, is that a pension is very political. It just creates, it has the ability for politicians to, unfortunately, tinker and add. So for example, in 2001, we had them retroactively increase benefits for state employees and for themselves. So legislators saw their pension increase 50%, and then they increased state employees 25%. But what we saw was within that one move, they added nearly $10 billion instantly to the pension liability. But because of the way it's set up, they had that ability. In 2002, we saw them give retired employees an increase of their benefits. The next factor was when we have seen the stock markets. So because pensions are they're a guarantee, so it doesn't matter how the stock markets do. We had the stock markets dip in 2003, and then we had the large stock market crash in 2008-09. And instead of, I would say manning up, but instead of realizing that we underfunded the pension system, what legislators did was they deferred their payments. So in the good years, when we had this surplus, legislators increased benefits and paid less into the system, because there's a certain amount they're supposed to be paying each year. But then when the stock markets did poorly, they decreased their benefits. And that's why when I talk about my niece Scarlett, by decreasing the benefits, they pushed off the payments to further generations, which we would say is bad. But another big problem with the pension system, the way it's designed, is that the unfunded liability is based on what's called return of expectations. And for a while, they were expecting that their investments were going to get an 8% return on investment. Now, what I've found talking to people who are much smarter than me is that's way too high. So if you're in the private sector and you're working with stocks, you're expecting at best maybe a 6%, a 5 or 6 is around a safe expectation. But with our pension system, the payments that they said that the school districts and the legislators need to pay in were based on expecting an 8% turn. When they recently, last year, 2 years ago, they reduced their return of expectations, so it was an 8%, and they reduced it just 5%, so to 7.5. That added $5.5 billion onto our unfunded liability. The point being that every time they don't get their expectations, it adds a significant amount to our unfunded liability. And what we believe is that even 7.5 is too high of a rate of return. So even that 41 billion we talk about is a lot. In reality, it's going to be much more. And what we expect is when they do their evaluations each year, that we're going to see them drop from 7.5 to 7%, and we'll see that grow. So Jen, just a kind of an overview, but really what we see is that pensions are political. And so what we want to do is kind of move the politics out of pensions. We think if you see an oil leak, if something's leaking, the first thing you want to do is stop the leak. And so how do we do that? We're advocating to get new employees into a new system to try to stop the leak that way. Now that is something in the governor's proposal, and I'm sure you're all aware that even really good policy that makes sense is going to face a lot of obstacles, which is really why what you do is so important, because they need to hear from you. And I know you guys know this, and I appreciate that you're a very active group, because that's one thing we hear from legislators is that a lot of times people who oppose these policies are very organized, and so they'll get a lot of emails, a lot of outreach. And so it's important for them to know that each side is equally informed in doing outreach. And that is part of why. So we want to see new employees into a new system, but it's going to be a lot of work. So what we're going to do is if we get new employees, we're stopping that oil leak. What we also need to do is consider how to address the unfunded liability. Now, the governor has suggested that you take current employees future benefits. So if you're a state employee or a teacher, any of the benefits you've earned up to date, they're yours and they're not going to touch them. But the governor has suggested that you look at current employees' future benefits. And what that means is right now you have a certain multiplier rate for your retirement. You might reduce that to where it was in 2001, 2002 when they did that 25% increase that we talked about, bringing it back down to that rate. One of the things that'll be interesting is that could likely go to courts. But again, we have to try to figure out how do we have this solution because we need to be paying. The reality is that as hard as an economic time as that is that we need to pay for the money we spend. I mean, we say that if you have a checking account, you manage your finances. We need government to do the same, to manage its finances. So what we're looking to do is to try to figure out that two-part solution. Part one is ending the leak, and then part two is addressing the current unfunded liability. And we know that there's going to be a lot of opposition on both sides because there's a lot of education that needs to be doing, that we're not trying to take away benefits from teachers. And to be clear, if you have friends that are teachers, and we certainly do, that we know it's not their fault. But really the solution is trying to find a better system. And as it connects to property taxes, certainly the issue is connected in that a portion, so if you're a state employee, your pension contributions are just paid really on the state level. But for teachers, it's paid in two different ways, and it's going to be partially on state taxes and partially on property taxes. But we do think that even if property tax elimination were to pass, that you'd still see higher taxes. So the issue has to be addressed because it's not going to go away. If it's not property, it's going to be a form of taxation that needs to be addressed. And that's really what I think we want to get to, is not just shifting where taxes are, but getting a government that spends less of our money, that is more responsible and can balance the checkbook. And I guess with that, I'll open up to questions. I don't know how much detail or background you guys have, but I'm happy to really go a lot of directions.
I have a question on a slightly different topic, but I'm going to wrap it right back into...
Absolutely.
So I'm going back to the pension thing. With LCB privatization, I know Commonwealth Foundation, I subscribe to all these.
Love that issue.
And, I know you've been supportive of it and pushing it for quite some time. But now I'm noticing that there's, the governor has a different plan of what to do with that money should the privatization plan take place. He wants to give it back to the schools to expand, I guess, math, science, and security and so forth. What's the Commonwealth Foundation's stance on what should be done with the money? And then I have another question for you after that.
Great, I love questions. I'd rather answering questions than have you guys just listen to me speak. But just so everyone's aware of what he's referencing, with the governor's liquor store privatization proposal, what he suggested is that the money that's raised from selling the state assets, well really our assets, are used to go to education. So he would create this, it's called a Passport for Learning block grant. And so the question is, what is our feeling on using the money from liquor privatization to education? I mean, we certainly think that transportation, corrections, and education are more of a government's responsibility than being in the liquor business. But we also think that there are far better areas that money could go to, one being pensions, the other being transportation.
Well, there you just said it. That was what I was going to suggest. Could the Commonwealth Foundation advocate for, if that does happen, rather than expanding recurring expenses at the schools, which this would do because it's a limited amount of funding, just like the federal stimulus money, it's going to go away.
Correct.
And if the schools expand their programs, they're going to have to keep funding it. Why can't we use that money to pay down this pension debt?
And I think there is a lot of support for that. And I mean, as I mentioned, I work a lot in our legislature, and there are a lot of very conservative, good legislators who are very concerned about putting the money back into education for what you just mentioned, because what we saw previously was that with the federal stimulus money, they were told that it was going to be, a temporary use of funds that should not be baked into the budget. And what we saw was that the stimulus money, a lot of them were used for salary and staff and really part of their general fund. And when that money went away, they kind of cried, oh, you're cutting our budget. which really wasn't the case. And so the concern would be that that would happen again. And Jim has a question or a statement.
Related to that, wouldn't putting the money into paying off the pension debt give the schools more money to put into education to allow that choice to be made by our schools, not mandated by our government?
Absolutely, and that's one of the interesting things for having this conversation is how people think the issues aren't connected. We actually saw an increase in education funds previously, but it went to pensions. And so you hear that, oh, they cut our education spending. Well, they didn't because of the stimulus fund, but also we're putting in more money. And then they say, well, pensions doesn't count. Well, if pensions isn't part of education, why do we have them? They need to all be connected. And so I think there's a good chance we will see the money, and we're very supportive of using it for pensions or transportation or something more of a core function need of government. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure I heard you deal with this, but what about having employees pay a large portion of their pensions while they're working? Just like we're paying their health care.
Sorry, can you say that again? What about having them pay more?
What's that?
What was your question?
I mean, I'm not sure how this works, but couldn't you have new employees or whatever start paying a large proportion of their pension while they're working?
And so one thing we do want to be
Now, would you favor that?
no, what I think you're saying we wouldn't, in the sense that we don't want to create a Ponzi scheme with our pension system where new employees coming in are paying for the retirement of current employees, because that's not how pensions were designed. I mean, we support, I want 100% of Pennsylvanians to have a retirement system that's adequate for them. I mean, we would not want anyone to go on welfare and unemployment. But we do think that you can have a pension, instead of a pension system, a 401k system that is good and provides. I mean, I know that my family, that's what we've used. So we would say instead of having new employees keep the same system and just pay more, it's far better to go to a 401k type defined contribution system.
I saw in an Economist magazine that's produced outside of this country naturally because it would never be able to be produced here, that refers to America's public servants as our masters now because of the pension issue. They're literally enslaving us. And if our legislators are going to go into a debate with these people with roses, the unions are going to be bringing clubs, and they're going to lose. They will lose. And some of these pensions even go beyond life. They have the option to take a lesser amount and extend it to a spouse that will cover their pension for their lifetime as well as their own. So it's beyond life for some of these people.
So there are some very important reforms that we hope to see through this, because there's a lot of abuse in the system. And one thing we've seen is that you can, though it's legal, because the pension is based on a calculation of your final years of salary, that you might have someone be a teacher and then bump up to a superintendent, take some like temporary jobs where they'll see their pension spike up, and you have people with $120,000 pensions, or you can actually work in county government, state government, and federal government. Some people are receiving 3 pensions. So there's a lot of areas where we see reform is needed. And one thing to be sure, right now the state is only looking at reforming state pensions and school teachers. But this is a huge issue for local governments. And that's one thing I hear from my township supervisor, and I'm sure you'll hear from a lot of these areas, is if you look at areas like Reading, they're having to fire a lot of their employees, and they're connecting pensions, saying we don't have the ability to address these needs that we have.
Yeah, because one other issue with that too is on my 401k, I cannot take money out of my own 401k until I'm 59 and a half years old without a penalty. Some of these people are retiring in their mid-50s at my expense. And they're bringing back the feudal state of government, where there are the nobles and the serfs. It's got to be hit hard.
I was curious that the new system for the defined contribution that would be put into play, would that money be invested in the stock market or in guaranteed accounts like FDIC, that kind of thing?
So there would be different options to how it could happen. I mean, what you see being proposed is that you would keep a financial investment institution still managing the money, and new employees going into it would actually be, it's similar to a 401k that they would be put in, that they would be required to have contributions made, and that someone would be managing their money. So you couldn't be a state employee or teacher and opt out. It would still be required that they would have an institution managing in the stocks. So you'd still have a professional person in the stocks.
It's not a guarantee.
Correct. It's not a guarantee.
Correct, I believe that the actual employee decide where he wants the money invested in his 401k. There's a certain amount of guidance that they can provide. In other words, some people go into gold certificates, some other people go into the stock market, other people go into bonds. So depending on the house that's managing, what instruments they have available, correct?
And it really could look very different. I mean, so that's what they're at the process right now, is debating how it will look when it's introduced. So right now, in the Senate, we have Senator Brown, who has going to introduce legislation that is just for getting new employees into a new system. Then you have the governor, who's come out with his proposal of saying getting new employees into a new system and addressing kind of current employees' benefits. But with the Senator Brown's bill, a lot of that isn't laid out. With the governor, which hasn't actually put all of the details out, I'm not sure, but I imagine it will have some flexibility with the guarantee that they'll have to. But it could look very different. In the back?
Yeah, I understand that in the private sector there are rules, very strict rules actually, in terms of how a pension is structured and what amount of funding is required. And there are strict consequences if that's not done properly. How different are those pictures for the percentage of unfunded amounts from that are allowed for the private sector compared to the public sector situation where we have 41 billion right now? I don't even know what percentage that 41 billion is.
I'm not sure if you were to compare organizations that have private pensions, how unfunded they would be. But what we do see is that there was a large portion in America where the private sector had pensions instead of 401ks. But what we've seen consistently is that the private sector is switching to 401ks type systems. So I mean, we're just seeing them slowly move away from the pension. And that's what we would encourage the government to do, is to kind of move with that best practices.
You know, what I was wondering is, when you say the current employees will go into the new system, whatever it may be, 401k or whatever. I don't mean current, I mean
New?
new.
Okay, perfect.
Why couldn't the current employees' pension benefits stop with what they earn, whatever they have agreed to get, and then put them also into the 401k plan, the new system, so that everybody would be the same?
And the question was, why couldn't current employees be put into a new system like new employees? And the reason is really just legally. They don't think because of the contracts they'd be able to put them into a new system. And that's the same question of, can they change current employees' future benefits, even by just, you know, it's interesting that you can take an employee and increase their benefits, but it's unconstitutional to possibly to reduce them. And so, I mean, that's really the reason they're not considering it. Yes, sir?
In my previous life, the company took my pension plan and decided, with the approval of the Pension Guaranty Corp, saying, you know what, we're going to give you an annuity, have a good life. But why is that not possible to do with the public sector employee pensions and give them an annuity and say, you know what, your annuity is paid up, this is the amount that's equivalent to, have a good life. I mean, they did that in the private sector 15, 20 years ago, and we're about that much behind in the government.
And that really is what we saw when we saw the private sector doing the switch from pensions. I mean, they can really freeze accounts, or they can close their pension accounts and switch them. But in the government, you do have the contracts, and that is why they can't do it, because it will go to court. And it is.
Contracts too.
But I'm not disagreeing that they're contracts. But I mean, that is why the constitutionality, I mean, even some of the smaller changes, I mean, I'm sure that you guys all know, this won't be a shock, these battles we're facing, I mean, we say the Commonwealth Foundation, a lot of these issues we're working on, liquor privatization, pension reform, we do a lot with school choice. One of the biggest obstacles we try to face, unfortunately, is the public sector unions, because they're very powerful and they have a lot of money and there's a lot of misinformation. And so for that point, there is not the belief that they could do it.
I would have to say, not to be rude, but also the answer to your question is the legislators and the judges are on this same system. There's no incentive for them to change that. I mean, that's a reality we have to face.
There is, I think it is Representative Eli Vankovich does have legislation to switch legislators to a defined contribution system. It probably will not, but it exists. Yes.
Do the teachers and the government employees, do they pay anything at all into their pensions?
Yeah, and so Pennsylvania is a state that does require teachers and employees to pay towards their pensions. And they have been doing that consistently. So, I mean, we do try to be clear that we're not at all blaming teachers or state employees for this system.
You talked about your granddaughter and getting the debt under control by the time your niece is 30 years old. It's presently $41 billion. If that would disappear tomorrow morning, would the system be soluble right now, or would it continue to build debt?
If you were to pay off the unfunded liability, what you're going to see then is that they're still expecting that 7.5% of return. And so your question, how would it do, would depend on how the market does, because they're guaranteeing employees these benefits based on the market, which you can't guarantee. Jim?
I just would like to draw everybody's attention to the fact that the state legislators who voted for this 50% increase served and taken oath to a constitution that says the legislative body shall receive wages and mileage and nothing more. Wages and mileage and nothing more. We have 10 people in our legislative bodies. 2 of them happen to be in Lebanon County, who have refused this. So we talk about the constitutionality of not being able to do this. I know when it comes to private sector, public sector employees, that's not what we're talking about. But the people who implemented this, the people who made it possible, the people who started all of this by voting for themselves, exceeded the authority granted to them in the state constitution to begin with, we shouldn't even have to have this conversation. It should have invalidated it back then.
I can say you certainly know Senator Fulmer, because you sound just like him.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good, well said. He sighed.
Anybody want to look and find somebody to blame it on? My name is George W. Blame everything on me. Want me to start this? This thing has so many tentacles and so many facets and so many different areas. And we're doing the same thing that we've seen the country do way back in 1933. For years, my friends have been laughing at me, and I've been saying to family members and others, what are you going to do when a loaf of bread costs you $20? I don't know what you're going to do when it reaches 20, because now when I'm looking at it and listening to her and looking at what's happening here month after month, it might not stop at $20 a loaf. It might go to $50 a loaf. Why am I saying that? What did Germany do? They run the printing presses. What are we doing? Running the printing presses. How long is it going to be until your dollar, you need 50 of them or a wheelbarrow load to buy a load of groceries at the store? Just the other day, I walked to a store. Down where I live in Lancaster County, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different stores. And each one of them would feed the city of Lebanon for 2 weeks or more. and they're building another new one. That's a lot of groceries and a lot of food. But if a loaf of bread costs $50 and all you get for retirement is $1,100 a month, you ain't gonna eat too much. Am I just facing the facts? Am I just nuts? Am I hoping that what she is saying and what we're all hoping occurs? Yeah, I think we can get out of this. Every day that we put up with this, it gets further and further down the road. I'm getting me a new wheelbarrow so I can carry enough money to go to the store.
Well, let me say, before we start paying $50 for bread, I realize one of the things that happens is often when I go to groups, it's to say bad things, and I know a lot of times it's really important because we need awareness of what's going on, but it can always get a little frustrating or sometimes a little depressing to hear about all the bad things that are happening. But just to share a positive thing, one of the major policies I was working on was criminal justice reform, so corrections policies in Pennsylvania, and last year we actually had a major victory where we saw a huge overhaul in the way our correctional system ran, which will save taxpayers money. It'll make our community safer, and it's really better for inmates. I mean, we had a very broken system. So while there are a lot of challenges, I know that the reason I work at where I do and why you guys are here is because we believe we can make a difference. And so I would encourage you that you can, and it's working. And so sometimes our changes are incremental and not as large as we want. But I believe that with active people, I mean, we will get there, and we have to because we love America, and we wouldn't stop. And I appreciate. I think Jim's coming over, so hold my plug.